one of the men who was for organizing the living of Abico, who is saying, don't forget that France is our strategic allies. So we need to be careful about that. The second point.
So what, don't burn the bridges completely with Bamako?
Exactly. I mean, because in a few months we'll see what will happen. The other point I'm talking about is the fact that we are all the camera, and that's right, are in Bamako. They are showing what's happening in Bamako. They are not showing what's happening in Tessalit, when the French forces were living. They are not showing the other side. And so currently you've got such a pressure that you've got this sort of reaction. That's why the French forces don't have to leave, because it's untenable to be there. But I think that we will see in a few months what will happen.
I fully agree that the kind of enthusiasm we have seen when France arrived in 2013 is exactly the same as the one we are witnessing with Russians. And I almost sure that the result will be almost the same, because I'm very doubtful about the capacities of Russian to change the strategic situation. But you're mentioning the northern Mali. It is another very important aspect which has to be taken into account, because, you know, the non-jihadi rebel groups have been reorganizing in northern parts of the countries and the country, and there is a very negative approach to their plans from Bamako. Finally, I think it is also important to recognize the fact that you're mentioning Imam Dicko, but why Imam Dicko has not been seen as a partner by French authorities? Today, yes, everybody is saying, Imam Dicko today is saying we don't have to cut bridges with France, but he was presented as an evil. There was absolutely no way to talk with Imam Dicko. And today we can see that, yes, he might be part of a political solution, and we are always coming back to this political solution.
So let me just ask you, General Trinquant, again, I say we're 8 weeks from a French presidential election. You've seen many French presidential elections in your time. Will it be easier for France to deal with what Gnagare Bakayoko was saying after April, once the polls have been... once the ballots have been counted?
You know, going out from an operation, it's like a motorway. You need to take the exit at the right time. Either in 2013, just after Serval, you've got to leave. Or after the election of Ibika, you've got to leave. Okay? Currently, this is the opportunity to leave, because they asked to leave. And I think for the president, this is the chance to show that things are changing. Under pressure, certainly, but things are changing. I think the French citizen will not understand if the French say we need to stay there. They understand that we've got to leave. And so that's a chance in 8 weeks before the election. Yes.
Okay, so definitely time to leave. But what about negotiating with those you didn't want to negotiate with before?
No, but the problem is that the negotiation is the problem of the Malian government, not the French government. But the French government was probably wrong on saying you don't have to discuss with these people. But the French forces were there just to fight, not to negotiate. And that was up to the Malian government to discuss. And I remember, we must be careful about the wording of how it was said. It was said, we will never discuss with the people who have the aim of imposing jihadists in the world. But we will discuss with the separatist movement in Mali, because it's a different sort of movement.
A semantic exercise, Michael Shurkin, or do you see that as the right policy?
It's such a sticky question. I know that for Malians, it's the same thing. And one of the biggest disagreements between Malians and France has to do with the fact that for France has always tried to define the bad guys as the jihadists and treat all the separatist and autonomous movements differently. Whereas for Malians, they're all sort of one and the same thing. And Malians have been very disappointed and angry that France seems to be indulging the separatists in their eyes. And they would really have France go after the separatists and not just limit themselves to the groups that France insists are the real jihadists. Again, because for the Malians, it's all one and the same thing. But it's a very tricky situation, and I'm sensitive to this because I understand that from a French point of view, getting involved in putting pressure on the separatists means getting involved in internal Malian politics, which is really very colonial. And that's something that France actually doesn't want to be doing. It doesn't want to sort of take this colonial role of arbitrating amongst the different warring parties in Mali, and therefore it likes to cling to what might in fact be a fiction, the idea that the jihadists are different from the separatists, and then focus on fighting the jihadists. And that's really been the French position. It's also, by the way, been the American position as well, right? To try to draw a strong line between the jihadists and all the separatists and insist that we don't want to have anything to do with the fight with the separatists because it's none of our business. So it's a real problem. To me, the answer to the problem that I think that the French should have been trying to avail themselves to has been trying to actually engage the Malians in this problem. In other words, recognizing that there's a fundamental difference of opinion and different perspective, and then trying to bridge that different perspective through dialogue. Might be impossible, but it's certainly something that they would need to try to do.
So let me bring in Paul Melly on this point.
Sure.
So you heard General Trinquant say there's an off-ramp for the French presence. You want us out? We're going. Here we go. We're out. You heard there Michael Shurkin say now's the time then for the Malians to take the bull by the horns with a political solution. How's this movie going to end?
Well, I think the huge challenge that is going ahead is not just the military withdrawal. It's less the political negotiation over the political transition, because, as I mentioned earlier, that's in a sense down to ECOWAS. But there is a real difficulty as to how to get enough of a security stability in central and northern Mali to begin to restore basic services, to begin to allow the state to provide, and in some cases it hasn't really ever provided, the sort of things that ordinary people need. And that's something that military force can't deliver, but you still need some security in the background. And that's the biggest challenge, because the Sahel is an incredibly fragile region. It's subjected to huge pressures of population growth, climate change, shortage of natural resources, and deep poverty. And we've had, for example, in 2021, the rainy season was poor, the crops were poor. There's a really quite serious food crisis that many households are going to face. And although the systems are there to get food to them, unless you have a sort of minimum of security, you won't be able to deliver it. And the problem is, in the present climate, because of these big political battles going on, we're seeing a sort of politics of gesture, unavoidably, really, if you like. But what it means is the low profile, day-to-day function of rebuilding ordinary security, of trying to get not so much the hardline jihadists who won't ever be convinced, but all the large numbers of disillusioned teenagers who got drawn into armed groups because they've got nothing else to do. Restoring basic stability, that's going to be massively difficult. And it's a problem not just for Mali, but for the wider Sahel. In one of the worst attacks in Burkina Faso in the middle of last year, those local people who survived said that most of the attackers were children of 12 or 14. So you've got a massive problem of disillusioned children drawn into armed groups, child soldiers. Then there's arms coming in from Libya. There's drug trafficking. I mean, there are huge complications to restoring basic stability in the region. And in a sense, just managing this high-profile withdrawal with all the politics around it will be delicate and difficult, but it's only a small part of how to tackle the wider Sahel crisis.
So one final question, I'll put it to you, Niagare Bakayoko, because if we look at the timeline of what's unfolding this week, the expected announcement of that withdrawal, and then this two-day summit that's been planned for a long time between the European Union and the African Union, is it good, the fact that this is all happening at the same time?
I'm not sure, because in fact I think there are lots of confusion. For instance, the Takuba force has nothing to do with the European Union. It is a political agreement.
Yeah, it's national armies.
National armies. It is not linked to the French ESDP and PSSD. So, no, I'm not sure. But what is important is the fact that the European forces will have and states will have to decide if they can follow up France in their future engagement in Sahel. And that's far from
With
sure.
all the development issues that Paul Melly was describing?
Absolutely, absolutely. Because today it is a fact that France is more seen as a risk than as a guarantee. So other European partners will have to think a lot before engaging very visibly with those French engagements.
Certainly, it's concentrating the minds on the eve of that summit in Brussels. I want to thank you, Niagare Bakayoko. I want to thank as well General Dominique Trinquant. Paul Melly with us from Niger, Michael Shurkin in Washington. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.
For decades, Tunisia has been seen as a producer of fashion and very rarely as a producer of fashion designers. But that's rapidly changing. For proof, look no further than the 12th edition of the Tunis Fashion Week, this year held not in the capital, but in Tozeur, at the gates of the desert. A closer look now at three larger-than-life Tunisian designers with big plans for the future.
I'm Hedi Ben Memi, fashion designer and IT engineer. My collection is inspired by military history, everything from Carthaginian history to Ottoman and French history. It's also an ode to liberation.
The pandemic, coupled with some instability, means sourcing supplies can be difficult.
COVID has meant we're importing a lot less. And that in turn is an incentive to use local materials, be that vegetable fibre or cotton. I've even worked with a material called beton, concrete in English, and it's real concrete that looks like leather. It's a material I created, and it's basically a leather substitute.
Technical innovation, but in the service of something bigger.
Fashion is about getting across a political message, because as you may have seen with the collection, there are some looks that I've used to mock some of the self-aggrandizement you see with politicians and the ruling classes. And that's mainly with the more extravagant pieces, those big breastplates. There's real humour there. It's actually quite tongue-in-cheek.
Saifdine Lawiti is the product of two cultures. He's half Tunisian, half Taiwanese. He based his collection on a concept in social psychology called reactance, the ways we try to hold on to our freedom when we feel it's under threat.
Tonight, my collection was about cyberpunk kids. I rail against censorship and the concept of sex. It's for the future iteration of Gen Z that doesn't want to succumb to those societal norms that older generations have succumbed to.
That's your response to the big social questions of the day?
To be honest, you have to have a message. Otherwise, you're just making more waste in the world. You either get a collection or a story, a concept with a message. We tried to regenerate the planet. We tried to save the planet. So yeah, either there's a message behind it, or well, maybe it's not for you.
Oh my
Upcycling was always been part of the Narciso house, but now it's an exercise of styling, it's an exercise of fashion, it's an exercise of imagination, it's an exercise of like, oh, okay, I have this. I've been doing this since 2012, I guess, since 2012. So yeah, I have a lot, like I did like a lot, but then what can I do with what I got and make it new, make it better, without actually getting new stuff or like adding more waste to the planet. So yeah, yeah, 100%. Like yeah, please, people, upcycle. I mean, like, if that's like what the hell, I don't know, but yeah.
Brahim Clay isn't even 30 years old, but he's been around long enough to have fostered a certain ambivalence about high fashion. So much so, in fact, that he developed the concept of anti-fashion.
When I first started out, I was 20, 21. I was very young. No one knew who I was, because a lot of the Tunisian fashion scene is made up of people who went to school together. I came from nowhere, and I showed my first collection in 2015. And my first show also prompted my first appearance in the French newspaper Libération. I appeared in the same editorial as Yamamoto, Rick Owens, Elie Saab, and I didn't know a soul. But I started making contacts, I met people, and there you go.
So what are you working on these days?
My fashion is conceptual, architectural, poetic, but also hardcore.
How hard is it to source all the materials you need?
My supplier is Tunisian, and he manages to find almost everything. He finds most of his stuff in Guangzhou, China. I've even got access to some 3D fabrics, which isn't bad when you think about what we have here. It's not even easy to get that sort of thing in Paris. When you're the kind of person who manages to make things happen, well, you make things happen. That goes for Tunisia, Jupiter, Paris, Ouagadougou. It's always the same.
This is Brahim Clay's 6th time at Tunis Fashion Week. His message is always the same.
I want to create things that are universal, with no nationality. You can't put me in a box. I'm free.
Hedi Ben Mami, Saifdin Lawiti, Brahim Clay. 3 designers united by their love of artistic freedom and proof that Tunisia is fast becoming a credible player in the world of design.
Paris welcomes members of the G5 Sahel countries for a mini-summit at the Élysée Palace. France is rethinking its future military deployment in the region after relations with Mali turned sour. Russia claims that it's withdrawing its troops from the Ukrainian border, but international observers aren't convinced. The US says Moscow has actually added 7,000 soldiers. The The UK also increasing its troop numbers as it doubles its NATO presence in Estonia. And at least 94 people have died after heavy rains triggered landslides and flooding in Petropolis, just north of Rio de Janeiro. Welcome back to the France 24 newsroom. I'm Fraser Jackson. It's good to have you with us. The presidents of Chad, Niger and Mauritania were in Paris on Wednesday to help form the French government's future deployment in the Sahel region. France's Operation Barkhane has been re-examined after the ruling military junta in Mali expelled the French ambassador from Bamako in January. Emmanuel Macron is expected to announce the withdrawal of the over 2,000 anti-terrorism troops still on the ground in Mali. His meeting with the other G5 Sahel countries came the day before the EU is due to meet with the African Union. Yinka Oyatade has more.
On the menu at the Elysee Palace's working dinner, the future of Operation Barkhane. French President Emmanuel Macron is keen to show he's not the only one pulling the strings, with other major players in attendance. Among his guests, leaders of the G5 Sahel forces and members from the European Union whose soldiers are stationed in the region as part of Takuba, a European military task force. Leaders are calling on the junta in Mali to cooperate after they went back on previous commitments to hold elections. In recent days, the French government has taken an increasingly hardline stance.
Le statu quo n'était pas possible.
The status quo is not possible with the deteriorating situation in Mali after the seizure of power by the junta, the refusal to apply a timetable for democratic return, and the use of private Russian militia.
After 9 years of military intervention, French forces have been unable to defeat jihadists in the Sahel. They've lost 53 soldiers in their own ranks to attacks on the ground. There are currently 4,300 French troops in the Sahel. More than 2,000 of them are stationed in Mali. The region is now holding its breath to find out whether Macron will confirm the withdrawal of troops from the country. Paris is counting on its allies to support states across the Gulf of Guinea. This is the threat of jihadist attacks continues to grow.
The departure of Barkhane and Takuba creates a vacuum. We will be forced to increase our defense forces. We will be forced to ramp up the protection of our borders. We will be obliged to buy weapons, to have a greater professionalization, but this is our duty too.
France is looking to transfer some of its troops to Niger. Hundreds of US soldiers are already stationed in the country. Niger is also home to Operation Barkhane's main airbase.
The United States has warned that false narratives and misinformation could be used as a pretext for a Russian invasion of Ukraine, an assertion Moscow denies. Ukrainian President Zelensky said his country is ready to protect itself, but despite that, NATO member the UK is doubling its numbers in Estonia, as well as sending armoured vehicles, as the threat of invasion still looms large. Russia claims that it has started withdrawing troops from the border with Ukraine, but the US says that instead it has added 7,000. International actors also say they see no evidence to support withdrawal.
So far, we do not see any sign of de-escalation on the ground. No withdrawals of troops or equipment. This may, of course, change. However, what we see today is that Russia maintains a massive invasion force ready to attack. We have been very transparent, and the intelligence we are sharing is actually confirmed also with open sources, with satellite imagery from commercial satellites.
While NATO and its allies aren't the only ones doubting Russia's claims of withdrawal, a Moscow-based investigation company is also calling foul. Our regional correspondent Gulliver Cragg went to find out more.
Ruslan Leviev heads the Conflict Intelligence Team, a Moscow-based investigations collective that observes Russian military maneuvers.
This video was filmed near the village of Koronevo in the region of Kursk. We see a train loaded with military equipment. It's the 2nd Regiment of Radioactive, Chemical and Biological Defence. The train arrived at the destination and unloaded yesterday. Afterwards, we observed the movement of these troops on the road, heading up to the village of Sudja. You see there, that's Sudja, and there, that's the border.
Ruslan Leviev says that far from pulling back from the Ukrainian border, Russia is concentrating ever more forces in the area.
This is one of the 3 videos published by Russia's Ministry of Defense. They indicate that this would be where the tanks leave after their exercises, but the tanks move in exactly the opposite direction, from the rail station towards the temporary camp. The divisions that the Defense Ministry says it is withdrawing are a drop in the ocean. Even if this retreat is effective, it doesn't change anything in terms of the deployment of forces. On top of that, a large number of the troops which are being withdrawn are still permanently based at the border with Ukraine.
In Leviev's assessment, the scale of the military deployment along the border is unprecedented in modern Russian history.
The number of troops massed at the border is enough for an attack and a serious war. We can see that it's not only troops that are being deployed, but also the National Guard, which would act as an occupying force. This would effectively be a military police office in the context of newly occupied enemy territory.
Ruslan Leviev has received threats and has once been physically assaulted as a result of his investigations.
Well, moving to Central America, Honduras' ex-president was in court on Wednesday as he faced an extradition request from the United States. Juan Orlando Hernandez was in office from 2014 until just 3 weeks ago, but now is wanted on drug smuggling charges. Washington has accused the right-wing politician of accepting millions of dollars in bribes in return for protecting smugglers moving cocaine from Colombia and Venezuela via Honduras en route to the United States. Hernandez denies the claims, but will remain in custody until an evidentiary hearing on March 16th. At least 94 people have been killed in the historic Brazilian town of Petrópolis. Rainfall on Tuesday exceeded the average for the entire month of February, triggering landslides that buried houses and washed cars away. Joseph Keane has more.
Scenes of destruction as heavy rains and mudslides hit. The deluge struck the city of Petrópolis, leaving scores dead and many homeless.
When this fell, I pulled my mother, and only one girl in the bar managed to get out. We went up that street and got into a neighbor's house, where I saw all the houses falling like an avalanche. Everything fell at once, something absurd. I never thought I'd see this in my life.
A number of survivors were found as searchers picked through the wreckage, with civilians joining in the efforts. The state fire department said the area received as much rain in 3 hours on Tuesday as in the previous 30 days combined.
The teams work 24 hours a day. They will not stop the search at all. It will continue unless for technical reasons it has to stop for 1 or 2 hours. But if everything goes normal, we won't stop at all.
Petrópolis' population has grown haphazardly over the years, with many tightly packed residences and inadequate drainage. The mountain region has seen similar catastrophes in the past, but plans to reduce the risk of landslides have been advancing slowly. The City Hall has declared 3 days of mourning.
And finally, police in Canada have issued an ultimatum to anti-restriction protesters that have brought the capital to a standstill for almost 3 full weeks. An order to silence their horns has been extended, and those blocking the streets or assisting others in doing so will now be arrested and face charges. The protests started with cross-border truckers fighting a vaccine mandate, but have since widened to include people unhappy with COVID-19 restrictions. Well, that's it for me. Do stay tuned to France 24. More news coming up shortly.
The mayor of Wieliczka looks out ruefully on what ought to be a hospital nearing completion.
The hospital facility is supposed to be built right here, then a rehabilitation centre behind that building over there, and where we're standing now should be a training centre.
What is being built is only a small part of what is planned. For the rest, the town was counting on money from the European Union's post-COVID recovery fund and had applied to the government for a share of it.
The minister wrote, "Good project, let's move ahead with it." But since then, silence. Everything is on hold because the reconstruction plan in Poland is not being implemented. Of course, this is because of the rule of law issue and the withholding of funds because of the European Court's ruling.
Wieliczka, like almost all Polish towns, has made great use of EU funds. They paid for buses, a new station, a library, and the restoration of the town's salt mine, a major tourist attraction. If the funds stop flowing, the reason, partly at least, is to be found at Poland's Supreme Court. In 2018, a new disciplinary chamber was created here to punish judges deemed to have acted unlawfully.
We support the Justice Minister's appeal against the regional court decision.
And who judges the judges? In short, judges appointed by the ruling party, hostile to those who oppose its judicial reforms. A threat to impartiality and a breach of European law, ruled the EU's Court of Justice, which ordered Poland to suspend the chamber's operations. It hasn't.
Today, they were to consider a case against Włodzimierz Wróbel, the true moral and symbolic leader of this Supreme Court.
Today, these lawyers are celebrating a small victory. The European Court of Human Rights ruled that the hearing should not go ahead.
Never before has the European Human Rights Court gone so far when ruling on cases like this. Normally, such urgent measures are taken only in exceptional cases, such as when someone's life or health is in danger.
For these campaigning lawyers, it is the life of Polish democracy that's in danger.
If the government succeeds in reshaping the Supreme Court the way it wants to, that would complete the establishment of an authoritarian system in Poland. It won't be a democracy anymore.
I think that Polish people now see that we are on a collision course with the European Union, because the Reconstruction Fund money is still not coming, and I see the heroic stance of those judges who are resisting the reforms as the last chance to save the justice system, because our citizens want to be in the EU.
The Polish government simply denies there is any problem, as do the pro-government judges appointed to the Supreme Court since the reform started.
The Polish judiciary is always interested in applying the law and respecting constitutional, and that means also European, standards.
Stępkowski says that the rebel judges are simply trying to preserve their own power, and that the EU institutions that have so sternly criticised the Polish judicial reforms are packed with friends of those rebel Polish judges.
When a friend calls you from another country and says he's being wronged, you tend to believe that friend. I haven't encountered a situation in which, when considering complaints about the Polish justice system, any foreign institution actually asked the Supreme Court to check on those accusations.
So you doubt these people's professionalism, basically?
Yes.
Włodzimierz Wróbel, the Supreme Court judge who was to have been up before the disciplinary chamber last week, is all too familiar with the authorities' portrayal of rebel judges as a self-interested caste. He rejects it out of hand.
It is against our personal self-interest to risk losing half our salaries, being suspended and barred from hearing cases, to become a public enemy and an object of hate for state propaganda.
But he says it's a question of professional ethics to abide by the law rather than accepting reforms that violate the law, and a duty to fellow Europeans to speak out about it.
The principles of the rule of law must be universal. That's why we can't tolerate this. One must pay attention. Sooner or later, this authoritarianism could come knocking on the door in Portugal, Spain, Italy, or any other country.
Judge Wróbel studied and now teaches at Krakow's Jagiellonian University, a bastion of liberal thinking during the communist era, ideas that triumphed in 1989 when democracy returned to Poland. But he says he saw this coming.
We've had such a brief experience of democracy, so even though I call it an authoritarian state, I still think that what's happening now is a sort of growth process, like that moment when a teenager has to go through a wild phase in order to become a full-fledged adult.
That same day, judges and sympathizers demonstrated in Kraków against the suspension of yet another protesting judge in a regional court in northern Poland. Those seeking justice in cases that she was presiding over will now have to wait just as Poland still waits for the EU billions to start flowing again.
Hello, everyone. You are watching Inside the Americas. Coming up, new emergency laws in Canada help reopen the Ambassador Bridge, but it hasn't stopped the protests yet. A closer look at reaction across the country with Peter O'Brien on the way. Then the dramatic downfall of the former president of Honduras, arrested following a U.S. extradition request on drug charges just weeks after he left office. And you'll meet some of the growing number of French tech developers going west to try and strike video game gold. I'm Jeannie Godula. Canada is set to ease entry restrictions on international travelers as long as they're vaccinated. Starting February 28th, visitors from abroad can get into Canada with a rapid antigen test instead of a PCR. That announcement comes as trucker-led protesters occupying the capital, Ottawa, show no sign of backing down. There is one bright spot for the government, though, as Luke Schrago explains.
An end to a border blockade in Canada, with this Alberta road now open to traffic and others following as police move on the final remaining protesters. The end of the weekend saw a major route linking the town of Windsor with Detroit in the United States reopened too. It handles a quarter of trade between both nations. In capital Ottawa, it's a different story, however, with demonstrating truckers occupying roads in the city centre for nearly 3 weeks, demanding an end to vaccinations needed to cross the border along with other health measures, and expressing substantial anger with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's government.
There's lots of dirty games going on. I hope that we can turn it around, because it's insane what they are doing. They are not representing the Canadians anymore. And they completely forgot the purpose, what they are there for. Working for the people, not against us.
Tuesday saw Ottawa's chief of police step down amid serious criticism over his handling of the crisis. Seeking headway and to give authorities a freer hand, Trudeau invoked the Emergencies Act, becoming the second Canadian leader in history to do so. Amid heated debate in Parliament, he justified his position.
These measures must be and will be compliant with the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. We will always defend the rights of Canadians to peaceful assembly and to freedom of expression, but these blockades need to end.
That may be harder than thought, with other Canadian provinces now demanding restrictions end, in particular the vaccine pass. This as the federal government ends the need for a PCR to enter the country.
For more now on the situation in Canada, I'm joined on the set by Peter O'Brien. Hi, Peter.
Hi, Jeannie.
You have been sifting through mountains of reaction to this state of emergency and the protests in Canada, and there's certainly been tons of it, both on social media and more traditional media.
Yeah, we're talking about a leader of a minority government who's imposed emergency powers in really peacetime. So, of course, you're going to get people on the internet who are comparing him to Hitler. But let's take a deep breath for a second and let's read the papers rather than looking straight at the internet. After Trudeau's decision, the Globe and Mail's editorial was actually somewhat sympathetic. It said the blockades were not legal protests, but a threat to the rule of law and democratic government itself. So the Globe's decided that the emergency powers are, in fact, could be justified if they're used with limited scope and time frame. But that's about where support for Trudeau in Canadian papers ends. The National Post's columnists question why the emergency measures are even necessary, given that other blockades were stopped without it. Greg Taylor said that in the province of Ottawa, well, they already had the power to deal with the blockade because they already had provincial emergency powers. But instead, leaders, national, provincial, just haven't put police powers to good use. Government officials, though, say it's not about providing more police muscle necessarily, as much as it is stripping the protests of their financial backing by doing things like bank account freezes. But the National Post's writers are very wary of this. Chris Selly, for instance, calls it a plausible solution, but says it's draconian and that it sets a dangerous
precedent. And while John Iverson hopes the measures will finally put an end to the blockade, well, he fears that stripping the bank accounts, things like this, will fan the flames of sedition rather than snuff them out.
Okay, Peter, that's what the two main traditional papers have had to say. What about the tabloids?
Well, the Sun didn't mince its words. It called Trudeau a bad actor. Their editorial says he just wants more division and more hostility, and it was his incompetence that made such an extreme measure necessary. The Metroland Media's 6 papers, they carried the editorial a last resort of and a failure of leadership, again saying that there were already adequate laws in place to deal with the blockade. And meanwhile, the Francophone press, well, they're not taking any victims either. 3 of Le Journal's opinion pieces described it as a failure of leadership as well.
Now, many people are also drawing a parallel to when the national emergency powers were put in place the last time, 50 years ago, by Justin Trudeau's father.
Yeah, that's right. So the backstory of the cartoon we're about to see here in the Toronto Star by Theo Moudikis, what you need to know is that in October 1970, the Quebec Liberation Front, which Canada listed as a terrorist group, well, they kidnapped a government minister and a British diplomat and asked how far he would go to restore order. Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau, Justin Trudeau's dad, famously said, "Just watch me." So he then invoked the War Measures Act and arrested almost 500 people to quell the unrest. Well, in this cartoon, Justin Trudeau is imagining himself as part his father and part the Terminator, about to terminate the protests. But in the cartoonist Moudikis' mind, well, actually, he's thinking that, but it's wishful thinking.
Peter O'Brien, thank you so much for that look at what the papers have been saying about Canada's situation, both the state of emergency as well as the ongoing protests. Now, our number of the week is this one, 73 million. That is the dollar amount of a landmark settlement out of the United States. It comes nearly 10 years after gunman Adam Lanza used a Remington rifle to shoot dead 20 first graders and 6 adults at Sandy Hook Elementary School. The now bankrupt Remington Arms will tap into insurance funds to pay the historic amount to 9 families, marking the first time a gunmaker has agreed to a major settlement over a mass shooting in the States. But for one victim's mother, this kind of legal justice will never be enough.
Our legal system has given us some justice today. But as I told Josh Koskoff a few weeks ago, David and I will never have true justice. True justice would be our 15-year-old, healthy and standing next to us right now. But Benny will never be 15.
All right, let's go now to Honduras and the dramatic downfall of former President Juan Orlando Hernandez. He was arrested just weeks after he left office. The right-wing leader's detention coming after a Honduran judge ordered his arrest following a U.S. extradition request on drug trafficking and weapons charges. Hugo Royer reports.
It's a spectacular fall from grace for one of Central America's most powerful men who ruled Honduras for 8 years. Handcuffed and chained, Juan Orlando Hernandez is paraded to the press at a police headquarters.
Que está con la firmeza de hacer cumplir la ley en una forma minuciosa y precisa.
Hours before, as police surrounded his home, Hernandez posted an audio message on Twitter thanking his supporters.
No es un momento fácil.
It's not an easy moment. I do not wish it on anybody. But I am ready to collaborate and voluntarily present myself in order to face this situation and defend myself.
The arrest came less than a month after the former strongman was replaced by Xiomara Castro as Honduran president. She swept to victory in November's election, vowing to end what she called the country's narco-dictatorship and corruption. And the new government and the judiciary were quick to respond to a U.S. extradition request. Washington accuses Hernandez of facilitating drug trafficking and using the millions of dollars he received in bribes to fund his political campaigns. He has been on a U.S. blacklist since July, and his brother is already serving a life sentence in the United States. The move stands in stark contrast to the U.S. government's previous relationship with Hernandez. The right-wing politician, who came to prominence after a military coup in 2009, was long regarded as a vital U.S. ally in volatile Central America. Honduras' Supreme Court has appointed a judge to oversee the case, and it may take several months before any ruling is delivered.
Our picture, or rather video, of the week is a strange one. A flock of birds dropping dead mid-flight, all at the same time. The security footage is from the northern Mexican city of Chihuahua, showing close to 100 yellow-headed blackbirds who were migrating south for the winter. A local vet says the birds may have died after inhaling toxic fumes from a heater nearby or because of an overcharge from electricity cables. But the official reason for their death still remains a mystery. We'll head west now to California's Silicon Valley, the heart of the global tech industry. It's attracting a growing number of video game developers from France, where the sector has been booming in recent years. Our colleagues at France 2 sent this report with Claire Rush.
For this French engineer, Silicon Valley has been the land of opportunity.
I always dreamed of working in tech. San Francisco is like the mecca of tech. It's an amazing place to work. We're surrounded by Google, Facebook, Twitch. All these companies that everyone knows were created right here.
Alex Casasovici launched his first video game startup in France, but it failed to take off. He then moved to California, where he created an interactive app for Twitch users, attracting investors.
When I was in France, investors looked for short-term gains. Here, investors care less about the short term. If they invest $1 in a company, they want to get $1,000 in return. They're looking for the chance to see a tenfold return or more on their investment in 10 years.
California is home to the developers of the world's most popular video games. The global gaming industry generates annual revenues topping $160 billion, far surpassing those of the film industry. The sector's rapid growth is fueling recruitment. That's how this French engineer arrived in Los Angeles. He works for one of the world's biggest gaming companies, designing the mobile app for Diablo. To get here, Quentin took night classes to learn how to code.
My father works for the Paris Public Transport Network, my mother for the Social Security. I've lived in public housing. It's not impossible. Look at what I've done. It's not as hard as it seems. There's no reason not to dream.
The coronavirus pandemic has further boosted the gaming industry, with some analysts predicting it will surpass $200 billion in value by next year.
Well, that wraps it up for this Inside the Americas. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you again next time for all the news from north to south.
The 25th of December 1991 marks the dissolution of the Soviet Union. On that day, a superpower broke up into 15 independent states. Our reporters visited Ukraine, Estonia and Georgia, 3 former Soviet republics that are now at the center of a new Cold War between Europe and Russia.
Здесь стоит памятник Иосифу Виссарионовичу Сталину, который был поставлен к 75-летию победы советского народа над фашистской Германией.
30 years after the collapse of the USSR, a new geopolitical battle is raging, fought with propaganda, tanks and hackers.
Cyber attacks can be as serious as physical attacks.
Don't miss the USSR Revisited on France 24 and France24.com.
Paris welcomes members of the G5 Sahel countries for a mini-summit at the Elysee Palace. France is rethinking its future military deployment in the region after relations with Mali turned sour. Russia claims that it's withdrawing its troops from the Ukrainian border, but international observers aren't convinced. The US says Moscow has actually added 7,000 soldiers. The UK also increasing its troop numbers as it doubles its NATO presence in Estonia. And at least 94 people have died after heavy rains triggered landslides and flooding in Petropolis, just north of Rio de Janeiro. Welcome back to the France 24 newsroom. I'm Fraser Jackson. It's good to have you with us. The presidents of Chad, Niger and Mauritania were in Paris on Wednesday to help form the French government's future deployment in the Sahel region. France's Operation Barkhane has been re-examined after the ruling military junta in Mali expelled the French ambassador from Bamako in January. Emmanuel Macron is expected to announce the withdrawal of the over 2,000 anti-terrorism troops still on the ground in Mali. His meeting with the other G5 Sahel countries came the day before the EU is due to meet with the African Union. Yinka Oyatade has more.
On the menu at the Elysee Palace's working dinner, the future of Operation Barkhane. French President Emmanuel Macron is keen to show he's not the only one pulling the strings, with other major players in attendance. Among his guests, leaders of the G5 Sahel forces and members from the European Union whose soldiers are stationed in the region as part of Takuba, a European military task force. Leaders are calling on the junta in Mali to cooperate after they went back on previous commitments to hold elections. In recent days, the French government has taken an increasingly hardline stance.
Le statu quo n'était pas possible.
The status quo is not possible with the deteriorating situation in Mali after the seizure of power by the junta, the refusal to apply a timetable for democratic return, and the use of private Russian militia.
After 9 years of military intervention, French forces have been unable to defeat jihadists in the Sahel. They've lost 53 soldiers in their own ranks to attacks on the ground. There are currently 4,300 French troops in the Sahel. More than 2,000 of them are stationed in Mali. The region is now holding its breath to find out whether Macron will confirm the withdrawal of troops from the country. Paris is counting on its allies to support states across the Gulf of Guinea. This is the threat of jihadist attacks continues to grow.
The departure of Barkhane and Takuba creates a vacuum. We will be forced to increase our defense forces. We will be forced to ramp up the protection of our borders. We will be obliged to buy weapons, to have a greater professionalization, but this is our duty too.
France is looking to transfer some of its troops to Niger. Hundreds of US soldiers are already stationed in the country. Niger is also home to Operation Barkhane's main airbase.
The United States has warned that false narratives and misinformation could be used as a pretext for a Russian invasion of Ukraine, an assertion Moscow denies. Ukrainian President Zelensky said his country is ready to protect itself, but despite that, NATO member the UK is doubling its numbers in Estonia, as well as sending armoured vehicles, as the threat of invasion still looms large. Russia claims that it has started withdrawing troops from the border with Ukraine, but the US says that instead it has added 7,000. International actors also say they see no evidence to support withdrawal.
So far, we do not see any sign of de-escalation on the ground. No withdrawals of troops or equipment. This may, of course, change. However, what we see today is that Russia maintains a massive invasion force ready to attack. We have been very transparent, and the intelligence we are sharing is actually confirmed also with open sources, with satellite imagery from commercial satellites.
While NATO and its allies aren't the only ones doubting Russia's claims of withdrawal, a Moscow-based investigation company is also calling foul. Our regional correspondent Gulliver Cragg went to find out more.
Ruslan Leviev heads the Conflict Intelligence Team, a Moscow-based investigations collective that observes Russian military maneuvers.
This video was filmed near the village of Koronevo in the region of Kursk. We see a train loaded with military equipment. It's the 2nd Regiment of Radioactive, Chemical and Biological Defence. The train arrived at the destination and unloaded yesterday. Afterwards, we observed the movement of these troops on the road, heading up to the village of Sudja. You see there, that's Sudja, and there, that's the border.
Ruslan Leviev says that far from pulling back from the Ukrainian border, Russia is concentrating ever more forces in the area.
This is one of the 3 videos published by Russia's Ministry of Defense. They indicate that this would be where the tanks leave after their exercises, but the tanks move in exactly the opposite direction, from the rail station towards the temporary camp. The divisions that the Defense Ministry says it is withdrawing are a drop in the ocean. Even if this retreat is effective, it doesn't change anything in terms of the deployment of forces. On top of that, a large number of the troops which are being withdrawn are still permanently based at the border with Ukraine.
In Leviev's assessment, the scale of the military deployment along the border is unprecedented in modern Russian history.
The number of troops massed at the border is enough for an attack and a serious war. We can see that it's not only troops that are being deployed, but also the National Guard, which would act as an occupying force. This would effectively be a military police office in the context of newly occupied enemy territory.
Ruslan Leviev has received threats and has once been physically assaulted as a result of his investigations.
Well, moving to Central America, Honduras' ex-president was in court on Wednesday as he faced an extradition request from the United States. Juan Orlando Hernandez was in office from 2014 until just 3 weeks ago, but now is wanted on drug smuggling charges. Washington has accused the right-wing politician of accepting millions of dollars in bribes in return for protecting smugglers moving cocaine from Colombia and Venezuela via Honduras en route to the United States. Hernandez denies the claims, but will remain in custody until an evidentiary hearing on March 16th. At least 94 people have been killed in the historic Brazilian town of Petrópolis. Rainfall on Tuesday exceeded the average for the entire month of February, triggering landslides that buried houses and washed cars away. Joseph Keane has more.
Scenes of destruction as heavy rains and mudslides hit. The deluge struck the city of Petrópolis, leaving scores dead and many homeless.
When this fell, I pulled my mother, and only one girl in the bar managed to get out. We went up that street and got into a neighbor's house, where I saw all the houses falling like an avalanche. Everything fell at once, something absurd. I never thought I'd see this in my life.
A number of survivors were found as searchers picked through the wreckage, with civilians joining in the efforts. The state fire department said the area received as much rain in 3 hours on Tuesday as in the previous 30 days combined.
The teams work 24 hours a day. They will not stop the search at all. It will continue unless for technical reasons it has to stop for 1 or 2 hours. But if everything goes normal, we won't stop at all.
Petrópolis' population has grown haphazardly over the years, with many tightly packed residences and inadequate drainage. The mountain region has seen similar catastrophes in the past, but plans to reduce the risk of landslides have been advancing slowly. The City Hall has declared 3 days of mourning.
And finally, police in Canada have issued an ultimatum to anti-restriction protesters that have brought the capital to a standstill for almost 3 full weeks. An order to silence their horns has been extended, and those blocking the streets or assisting others in doing so will now be arrested and face charges. The protests started with cross-border truckers fighting a vaccine mandate, but have since widened to include people unhappy with COVID-19 restrictions. Well, that's it for me. Do stay tuned to France 24. More news coming up shortly.
It is 30 years since the consigning into history of the world's first communist state, home to an approaching 290 million people, the end of the Soviet Union. President Mikhail Gorbachev, lauded in the West as an icon who'd ended the Cold War and the threat of nuclear war. But at home, his perestroika reforms designed to hold the Soviet Union together, leading to economic hardship, shortages of food and crime, the basis of communism that bound together the Union's 15 different republics under threat. Well, as Gorbachev tried to negotiate a new treaty, including the devolution of power, most in his government rebelled. A coup attempt as tanks rolled into Moscow. The coup thwarted largely due to this man, the new leader of the Russian Republic, Boris Yeltsin, who famously gave a rousing speech from a tank. Yeltsin cementing his place as a strongman, humiliating Gorbachev in a session of the Russian parliament, and signing a decree banning the activities of the Communist Party on Russian soil. Gorbachev's power base lost, one by one, the republics turning towards on the independence. On the 25th of December 1991, Gorbachev officially announced his resignation, and the red flag of the Soviet Union was lowered over the Kremlin.
In this situation, which follows the establishment of the Commonwealth of Independent States, I hereby cease to act as the President of the Soviet Union.
Well, since those dramatic moments, how have Russia and its former republics fared? Well, in today's programme, we revisit some of them. We're going to start with the main one, Russia itself, then to Estonia with high-tech modernisation, to Ukraine, a country torn in two, and to Georgia as well, where critics say Russian influences remain through religion. And we'll even take you into space, to where a Soviet astronaut was stranded on board the Mir space station for 311 days. Well, our correspondents James Andre, Sylvain Rousseau and Ashraf Abid revisit the former republics of the Soviet Union for France 24.
Mir, some 300 kilometers above Earth. Inside, Sergei Krikalev watches the USSR crumble. A ruined Russia inherits the Soviet space program and asks the cosmonaut to stay on and save the space station.
At the time, they had to reduce Soyuz launches drastically, and they also absolutely had to keep someone on board the Mir station for maintenance, so they eventually asked Krikalev to stay on.
Krikalev holds out for 311 days before Germany spends $24 million to send one of its citizens to the station, allowing Russia to return him. The last Soviet citizen has just become the first Russian space hero.
Relief is what Sergei Krikalev, the cosmonaut stuck in space for nearly a year, must have felt this morning when a crew arrived to replace him. Krikalev left the Earth as a Soviet citizen. He returns as a Russian. On his right arm, he still bears the acronym USSR.
When Krikalev lands, the communist empire has broken up into 15 independent countries. The Iron Curtain falls to reveal a fully blown economic crisis. People are faced with food shortages and hyperinflation. The Baltic states immediately decide to free themselves from Russia's influence and turn to the EU. Estonia invests massively in new technologies and opens its market up, with three goals: eradicate corruption, bureaucracy, and poverty.
And that was a point where Estonia realized already 30 years ago that we can't continue doing things on the exact same way.
Today, 99% of administrative procedures can be done online. Taxes are low and business is thriving.
Today, Estonia has one of the largest number of startups per capita. Where business is easy, business will grow.
Thanks to this zero red tape policy, startups make up 10% of Estonia's GDP. This former aerospace factory is now home to Paktum, a company that offers artificial intelligence-based software that automatically renegotiates contracts between companies and their suppliers.
I am pretending to be a supplier at the moment, and the enterprise contacted me that maybe we can improve the contract for both sides.
Some Estonian startups have enjoyed huge success, such as Skype, Bolt, or TransferWise.
Economy of Estonia has been increasing the most out of all the ex-Soviet Union countries, and it is the effect of these technology companies that have created this value via people, technical skills, and having global ambition.
Estonia joined the European Union and NATO in 2004. The USSR's former enemy is now on Russia's doorstep. Moscow couldn't stop the change but retaliated 3 years later with the first cyber attack on a foreign state.
These attacks later have become known in history as the first time that cyber attacks have been used for political goal. These attacks in 2007 showed, both for the political decision makers as well as the people, that cyber attacks can be as serious as physical attacks. And cybersecurity really is part of an overall security.
Russia has never attacked a NATO member state militarily, but remains an intimidating neighbor, with troops constantly massed on the border that hold major exercises every 4 years. A threat backed by a history of Russian military invasions in former Soviet republics. In 2008, Russian troops entered Georgia to defend a pro-Russian separatist minority in South Ossetia. The fighting lasted for 9 days, caused over 1,000 deaths, and displaced 150,000 people. Despite pressure from the international community, the Russian army never withdrew. 13 years later, kilometers of razor wire mark what has become a de facto border.
I had a plot of land over there, but they locked me in with this fence, and I lost it. My relatives don't come here, because if they cross the line, they'll be arrested. I have no one here. This fence has ruined my life.
20 Russian military bases like this one dot the 350-kilometer-long demarcation line.
We face a so-called borderization process. We face illegal detention of the people. Also, we face the military drills on the ground. Russia is deployed on our land illegally, and they are occupying our region. They are trying to have annexation policy on the ground. It is a threat for European security overall.
Russia is also accused of working to undermine Western influence in the country. Sunday prayer is popular in this deeply religious society. After the independence, the Georgian Orthodox Church became the backbone of the Georgian state, cementing society around its traditional values.
Religion has a very important place in my life. This church is very close to my heart. I've been coming here since I was 4.
The country should be free. It should be free of negative influence and restrictions, especially free of any foreign influence.
84% of Georgians define themselves as Orthodox Christians, and many feel their traditions are threatened by Western liberal values as the country prepares to formally apply for EU membership in 2024.
Of course, the Church supports the idea of Georgia becoming a Western democracy. And we are a part of Europe. But we shouldn't have to lose our culture, to lose our traditions, and replace them with other traditions.
If a vast majority of Georgians support the country's bid to join the EU, most also reject the bloc's policies regarding LGBT rights. In July 2021, a pride march was cancelled amid protests and violence.
Around 4,000 people were mobilized by church, and they were therefore praying in front of the parliament. So it was a peaceful anti-LGBT protest. But around 1,000 people were this active physical force which executed the operation, and they were scattered all around the city. On that day, the EU flag were burnt twice.
For Georgi, there's more to the protests than homophobia.
It's not about LGBT rights. It is used, it is weaponized to undermine the pro-Western path, but the overarching idea is Russia trying to destabilize the country, using LGBT rights to create this political tension in Georgia, to attack the Western values, because the LGBT rights is considered as something coming from the West.
For now, the Georgian government remains committed to its EU integration plans. In In Kiev, Ukraine, thousands took to the streets in 2013 to ask for a path towards EU integration. The Maidan Square was occupied constantly for over 3 months, resulting in the resignation of the pro-Russian president. The Kremlin's response was swift and brutal. Paramilitary forces entered eastern Ukraine to support the anti-EU Russian-speaking population. Since Russia has annexed Crimea and Donbass is locked in a latent war.
Russia is already operating inside Ukraine. What other proof do you need? When we capture prisoners of war, they have Russian passports.
This former factory in Advika is on the front line. The enemy is just 100 meters away. Here, the fighting never actually stops.
They have no strategy. They shoot at anything, at any moment.
At the end of 2021, Russia started massing troops on the border. Observers worry about an invasion, but these soldiers are dubious.
They say an attack is imminent, that Russians are amassing their forces. I don't think it's going to happen. They'd lose too many men.
The Ukrainian government has no means to force the Russians out, so it has decided to fight back on the ideological front. A law voted in 2015 bans all traces of the Soviet era. Streets and cities named after Bolshevik leaders have to be rebranded. Toretsk, a declining miner town, is a good example.
In accordance with the Ukrainian law on the condemnation of the communist and National Socialist or Nazi totalitarian regimes and prohibiting the propagation of their symbols, Dzerzhinsk is renamed Toretsk.
Dzerzhinsk, named after Felix Dzerzhinsky, founder of the infamous Cheka, the communist political police responsible for the killing of hundreds of thousands of Soviet citizens.
That was a person, Iron Felix as they called him.
Why that name?
Well, I suppose those were his character traits. Toughness.
In Russia, his statues were torn down 3 decades ago. In Toretsk, they stood proudly until 2015. At the time, Andrei Grudkin, an activist, realized how little people actually knew about Dzerzhinsky.
One girl said he was a great Russian general. One woman said he was a Soviet statesman who looked after children. It really showed how people don't know their history.
For Andrei, de-Sovietization is necessary.
There are symbols of totalitarianism, statues of people who tortured and killed millions of their own citizens, who created man-made famines, who sent people to rot in the camps. Should we have waited a few more years or debated whether these were actually good guys and should stay in place? No way. I think everything was done absolutely correctly.
While statues are being removed in Ukraine, Russians are putting up new ones.
This is a monument to Joseph Stalin. It was put up on the occasion of the 75th anniversary of the Soviet people's victory over Nazi Germany, a tribute to the Generalissimo, the commander-in-chief, the one who saved the world from fascism.
Alexei Zorov's next step is to build a museum dedicated to the dictator.
Here there will be a building, 20 meters by 14. It will be a big building of around 1,000 square meters. It's our history. It's the history of the Soviet Union and of Russia. It's the history of every person who lives in Russia.
We're fans. Stalin's my hero. I've been waiting to see a monument like this for a long time. At last, his achievements are acknowledged.
What do you think of Stalin?
He's really interesting.
See, she's interested. He's the Generalissimo, right?
It's unbelievable. We were passing by and we saw the Stalin monument. Why would you do that? My great-grandfather died in a camp. He was executed in 1938.
Bloodthirsty tyrant to some, war hero who defeated the Nazis to others, Stalin is a divisive figure in Russia. Alexei knows where he stands, despite the fact his own grandfather was killed in the Stalinist purges.
It wasn't Stalin who came to arrest him, but local officials. Why should Stalin be held responsible? Should Putin be held responsible for what I do, for example, because he's head of state?
The communist ideology is very much out of fashion, but most Russians love a strong man, a fact Vladimir Putin, who has ruled Russia for 20 years, understood early on.
We really do not want to burn bridges. But if someone perceives our good intentions as indifference or weakness, and himself intends to finally burn or even blow up these bridges, then he should know that Russia's response will be asymmetrical, rapid, and brutal.
The master of the Kremlin is bent on filling the void left 30 years ago when the USSR collapsed.